Hello everybody, this is Pramod Nair of the Department of English, University of Hyderabad. In this session we are going to be looking at William Blake's famous poem London. We will begin with a short quick introduction to William Blake. Born in 1757, Blake was interested in mysticism, philosophy, wrote extensively on subjects connected to both. He is believed to have had visions from a very early age. And during his lifetime, he was opposed to all sorts of organized religion, had problems with institutions like the church, but also monarchy. He was a noted dissenter and was frequently in trouble with both the church and the government of England. Many of his poems, such as the longer ones, The Song of Laws, America, Jerusalem, Milton, are essentially visions that are semi-religious in nature. The content has not always been very well understood because Blake had a certain mythological system in place. He was also an engraver, and several of his poems are accompanied by sketches, drawings and etchings. He had very strong views on slavery, which he opposed, and on gender inequality. It must be remembered that Blake lived during the time of the Enlightenment, an age characterized by an emphasis on rationality, reason and scientific thinking. Blake believed that scientific thinking and knowledge were not adequate enough. They only formed one route to the truth. He believed in the passion of the soul, impulses, madness, creation, creativity and the so-called irrational ideas of geniuses. Mystic disorder, which believed that order emerged out of chaos, was not something the rational mind of the Enlightenment believed in. Blake is often regarded as a pre-romantic poet because his views on instinct, nature and the imagination anticipate the works of William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Blake's poem is concerned with the so-called greatness of the city of London. He demonstrates how the city is actually a place of tyranny, misery, suffering and social injustice. So rather than chart the greatness of the city of London, Blake focuses on the negatives, the downside of a so-called great city. The poem argues and suggests that the elite, the upper classes, which includes the aristocrats but also the businessmen, the bankers, have chartered, a word that occurs repeatedly in the first section of the poem, have chartered and divided the city amongst themselves. The poor have nowhere to go. As the poem proceeds, we see three major examples of this poverty and suffering that Blake hopes to showcase. The chimney sweeper is what we now recognize as a child laborer. The soldier fights battles and has perhaps come back injured from the wars. The harlot or the prostitute is poor and now has a child to feed as well. These are the principal characters in the poem. They become emblems or symbols of how a city has become indifferent to poverty and suffering. More importantly, Blake here, as in other poems of his, wants to show how the city has created this poverty and the suffering for all these people. In the process of talking about these characters, Blake criticizes the three major institutions in the course of the poem: the church, the palace, which is the institution of monarchy, and marriage. So, this is something we need to keep in mind, that Blake has three principal characters: the chimney sweeper. For those of you who know a little bit about Blake, you will recognize that the chimney sweeper is also the poem by Blake, the chimney sweeper poems. The second character is the soldier who has come back from the wars which he fought on behalf of the nation and is perhaps injured. And finally, the prostitute. So, the poem revolves around the sufferings of these three principal characters within the city of London. These three characters represent the institutions of religion, by which of course he is referring to Christianity. It refers to the palace or the institution of monarchy, and finally the harlot or the prostitute, who refers to or emblematizes the institution of marriage. As I said in my introduction, Blake had a series of ideas about religion and institutions which he worked through several poems. So, in order to understand this particular poem London, one also needs to recognize its connections with other poems. Many of the poems in his early volumes, Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, these are two of Blake's most famous collections, deal with the key questions of poverty, human compassion, love, and God. The chimney sweeper poems, which have been very famously anthologized, the Holy Thursday poems, the Divine Image poems, and others, all deal with the ways in which humans are cruel to fellow humans. Blake, we must understand, was very concerned with the issue of cruelty, and he argued in most of his poems that we did not look at God as being cruel, it's humans who are cruel to other humans. And Blake was consistently harsh upon humans for this infinite capacity to be cruel. These are also poems that attack institutions like the church, like the financial system. One must remember that London was the financial capital of the Western world in the 18th century. By 1780s and 1790s, London was also beginning to be the capital of its great empire. He attacked institutions like conventional religion for not really addressing the poor and their poverty. Blake, in fact, and this is the radicalism of Blake I mentioned before, blamed religion for ensuring that some people in society were always kept poor. A poem that I would like to quote from at this point is The Human Abstract, in which Blake made a very radical and extremely frightening in its truth statement. This is what Blake says: "Pity would be no more if we did not make somebody poor." This is obviously a line that sounds like a contradiction, but actually if you think about it, it is not. What he is proposing, what Blake is proposing here, is that we cannot show pity unless there are poor people to show pity towards. Therefore, we try and make sure that some people stay within poverty in order for us to show pity and compassion. This is Blake's attack on the so-called philanthropy or the so-called generosity that we show. It is only because there are poor people that we are able to show charity. Our charity is not based on our inner or innate goodness. It is based, therefore, on a social condition of injustice where there are too many poor people. So, think about these lines again. Pity would be no more if we did not make somebody poor. The crucial word is make. We make somebody poor, that is, we see that there is a system of social injustice that keeps somebody poor. We ensure that some people stay within poverty so that we can show them charity. Our generosity is not about human goodness at all. That's what Blake is saying. And incidentally, the poem is titled The Human Abstract, which is an essence of the human in which we try to show that pity is what makes us human, compassion is what makes us human. Blake is saying, not at all, it's not pity that makes us human, it is that we keep doing these cruel things to people, and then we show pity. So these are the affiliations that we need to remember. These are the other poems which we need to also perhaps read. So I would recommend that you browse through Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, especially the Chimney Sweeper poems and the Holy Thursday poems, so that you can see how the poem that we are discussing here, London, actually contains several of the themes that you can detect in other poems as well. Pay some attention to the stanzas, to the language of the poem. After all, poetry is expressions of emotions or themes within particular kinds of language. The word charter occurs twice in the first stanza. Charter actually means a license issued to any corporation or business house to conduct certain kinds of business or activities. London, please note, as I have already mentioned, was a seat of commerce. Blake is referring to the city as a commercial center, as a commercial space. Chartering, we do talk about chartered buses and chartered flights. Chartering is a business activity, and he speaks of the city itself as a chartered city. But chartered also has another meaning. Charter also means to map, to draw boundaries, to demarcate territories, roads, streets. Charter means to put up signs which says do not enter or exit only. It signifies how a city is mapped so that some people are allowed to walk in certain areas, move across certain areas, or prohibited from entering certain areas. It is not, please remember, an informal arrangement. These are arrangements made by law. Blake is referring to the fact that a city like London is not an open city, that buildings have been mapped, spaces, boundaries made, and that property is not owned by everyone. Ownership is a central issue here. The public streets are not truly free because the poor are not allowed to own it. It is not only that the poor are not allowed to own it, the poor are sometimes not even allowed to walk in those areas and use it as public or common property. Even the river, he is referring of course to the river Thames on which the city of London stands, is chartered, says Blake. What Blake is suggesting here is a takeover of the city by particular sections of the people, by the elite. And he refers to the poor as being full of weakness and full of woe. The city is not an open city, is chartered by some, and others are excluded. Every man and child, he says, is subject to tyranny and suffering. And the famous phrase that he uses is, he can hear the mind-forged manacles, manacles which restrict movement. Blake therefore sees suffering as physical, where poverty makes people sad. But this suffering is also due to the way in which the consciousness of the people is manacled. It's worth spending some time thinking about the phrase mind-forged manacles. What Blake is arguing or proposing with that extremely horrific image is that after some time, in a condition of oppressed social systems, the human beings who are living in poverty accept their poverty. The mind-forged manacles are a reference to the consciousness of the people that have been restricted, limited, and been trained to accept their suffering. You cannot think other than in this way. What he is saying is what people, later commentators like Karl Marx and others would say, that oppression is in your mind. Oppression is in your mind because you have been oppressed for too long and you cannot think in any different way. So the reference to the word charter in the early sections of the poem connects with the mind-forged manacles. It's about the limitations and the limitedness of the poor to think outside their poverty. It's the only life they know. It's the only way they know how to think. This is what constitutes the theme of order and tyranny. A city is well ordered because the poor are kept out. The poor are not allowed to move here and there. If you want to look at a contemporary example that illustrates this, take a look at shopping malls, which is a comparable parallel. The shopping mall is actually a city taken inside, but it's also a guarded, sanitized space, isn't it? It's ordered. You are told where to walk, you are shown how to walk and where. It's a very clean, secure space. It's not in a very strict sense public space, because you can be prevented from entering a mall. You cannot actually be prevented from walking on the city's roads. That is the point I am trying to make when Blake is referring to the chartering of the City of London. London is not open space where everybody can go everywhere. No, it's you go here or you go here. Some people go here, other people go here. The chartering refers to the lack of freedom. In short, the poem is about freedom, that you are not allowed to think in a different way, you cannot walk in a certain way, you cannot walk in certain places. The city has been divided and you do not have the freedom to operate in any part of the city that you want. You cannot go to any part of the city you choose to go. Right? So, this is about order and tyranny, because order can emerge in the City of London only through the tyranny of the charters. I have already mentioned that Blake was interested in this poem and in other poems with three principal institutions: religion, marriage, monarchy or the government. It is represented by three people in the poem, or three characters: the soldier, the chimney sweeper and the prostitute. Okay. And I would now like to look at the question of the institutionalization of suffering. If you recall what I just said about the human abstract, that it's social injustice that allows us to be charitable towards the poor, Blake's poem is going to build on this particular theme. Blake shows the church walls as having become black. How does the church wall become black? The church wall becomes black with the chimney sweeper's cry, says Blake. What does the chimney sweeper do? The chimney sweeper, historically speaking, if you know anything about the social history of England, was a small boy whose job was to go up the chimney with a broom and clean the chimney. If you want to take a moment to think about this, when you go up a chimney and clean the chimney, where does the soot fall? It falls on the boy cleaning it, right? So, the boy goes up, sweeps, cleans, and the soot falls on him. The chimney sweeper usually came down the chimney looking black because the soot fell on him. And the chimney sweeper was known for having soot in the hair, soot on the face. And what Blake is saying here is something very interesting. The chimney sweeper's cries are also black, in the sense he has inhaled so much soot, his being, his very subconscious being is black, his inner self is black. At this point I will take a little digression. Blake was obsessed with the color black because Blake was a printer, and what is the color of the ink printers use? Black. So, the entire William Blake corpus of poetry can be looked at for the use of his color scheme. Now, what Blake is saying here is the chimney sweeper who goes up the chimney comes down looking black, his cries are also black, but what Blake does is something more significant. He says these cries color the church walls black. Now, the second example he gives is the soldier's blood which runs down palace walls. When does a soldier shed blood? When he is in war. In the course of the war, he has injuries and he suffers severe injuries, as a result of which the blood flows. Something to think about here. The chimney sweeper who has been crying, the soldier who has been shedding blood. What Blake does is to show how their respective conditions, soot and blood, discolor the institution's walls. So, he is saying that the chimney sweeper's soot face, his cries, discolor the church walls. The soldier's blood discolor the palace walls. What's important is to see that in both cases the institutions are unmoved and unchanging. The church is indifferent to how the boy, the chimney sweeper, suffers. The church is indifferent to the pain of the chimney sweeper, and the palace is indifferent to the suffering of the soldier. Nothing changes for the chimney sweeper or the soldier who have spent their entire lives serving these institutions. What Blake is saying is the church and the palace is kept intact because these people work like slaves. The palace is safe because the soldier fights his wars. The state or the country is safe because the soldier loses his life or his limb in battle. The church is kept clean, the houses are kept clean because the chimney sweeper goes up the chimneys and comes down dark, blackened with soot. But the institution itself remains clean and pure. Here again, let's recall what we have already heard. Pity is no more if we do not keep somebody poor. The church would not be a church if the chimney sweeper doesn't become dirty. The state doesn't remain safe if the soldier does not lose blood. So what we are looking at here is the indifference of the institution to the suffering of the people who make the institutions run. Finally, there is the case of the prostitute who curses the institution of marriage because the man who was perhaps once her customer has now gotten married. In addition, she has a child, and the poem is extremely cruel, we would think, when he says the harlot cursed the child and cursed the marriage of this man. Why does the mother curse the child? The mother curses the child because the mother never believes that the child will have a proper upbringing. She is poor, she doesn't have any kind of regular employment, and the father is now married and gone away. What is it we take away from these three examples? What exactly is Blake saying here? Think about this. In each case, it is a particular individual whose sacrifice keeps the institution going. What Blake is looking at, and I have mentioned this indirectly before, is the indifference of the institution to the suffering of the people who keep it going. It is what we say all the time, isn't it, that the government is indifferent to suffering. If you look at contemporary coverage in newspapers, we are all the time reading about how institutions don't really care. Blake is already talking about it in 18th century England, which is both a kind of prophecy of where the world is going, but also an extremely savage criticism of how London functioned. So the three institutions that have been attacked are the church, the palace as a symbol of the state or government itself, and finally marriage. Blake was an experimentalist. He tried new and strange things, not always successfully, but definitely all the time puzzling his readers, and this is an example of that particular experimental style. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. Blake's opening stanza uses the R, the ARR sound repeatedly. Chartered, marks. Think about that. Sound is the most common image in the poem. He is not writing a visual poem, he is writing an oral poem where the sound is essentially the theme. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. There are people crying, there are people screaming, and there are people cursing, all to do with sound, right? Blake shows how sounds work. But very importantly, Blake shows other effects of sound. Let me go back a minute to the earlier point I made about how the chimney sweeper's cry blackens the church wall. Were you puzzled by what I said? How does a cry make a wall black? A cry is not paint. A cry is something you hear. The blackening of the church wall is the result of something physical, like something painting on the wall. So how does a cry, a boy's cry, darken the church walls? This is a phenomenon called synesthesia. It's a particular kind of literary usage which people like Keats would use. What Blake is showing is the mixing of senses. What are the two senses being mixed? Sound and sight. The boy's cries and the discoloration of the walls of the church. Likewise, the shedding of the blood and the darkening of the walls of the palace. It's a mixing of the senses because the chimney sweeper's cry and the soldier's sigh, he's sighing, he's sad, discolor the walls. How the chimney sweeper's cry every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. If you look at all the first letters of the third stanza, what we get, the first letters are H, E, A and R. What does H, E, A and R come together do? It produces the word hear, which again refers to sound. Remember, I already told you that the poem is about sound. The cleverness is that you have to discover this in the poem. Unless you pay attention, you do not understand how Blake's working this theme. In the last stanza, a cycle of disease and suffering is given. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. He refers to blights with plague, which refers to perhaps sexually transmitted, that is venereal disease, that the prostitute may have passed on to the man. The curse is possibly this disease. The man has picked up the disease from the prostitute and the man is likely to pass it on to his wife. And it is also possible that the newborn infant, the prostitute's child, also is cursed. The curse might refer to either the disease or the curse of a life in poverty, or perhaps both. The child therefore is doomed to suffer as well. Blake links death with the marriage bed when he uses the word hearse. Hearse actually is a thing in which the dead bodies are carried, but hearse, H-E-A-R-S-E, is also anagrammatically H-E-A-R. Think about the cleverness of this poet. We have already referred to hear, H-E-A-R, about sound, and now hearse, H-E-A-R-S-E. There is a play on the word. It is also referring to the word hear, but it is also pronounced hers, as in her, hers, right? So, it connects to the word hears, and the sound imagery of the poem is more or less complete. Another example, the word appall, A-P-P-A-L, which actually means to make dim, to lose light, to lose visibility, to darken. The word appall connects to the image of death in stanza 4, because appall is a play on the word pall, a-pall. Pall is funeral cloth in which the body is wrapped. And when we now say appall, we are also referring to the word shocked. Oh my God, is an appalling expression, right? We are appalled at something that happens. Think about these ones, the experimental way in which Blake's London seems to proceed. The larger theme of the poem might be, if you want to summarize it, the institutionalization of suffering itself, that an institution thrives on the suffering of its people but is indifferent to how they suffer. That an institution demands that you sacrifice yourself to the working of the institution, whether it is religion or marriage, and yet the institution does not come to your aid when you need help. Thank you.